the first activity of the new semester for the Belgian branch of the International Law Association in cooperation with the Brussels Diplomatic Academy. And today I have a great pleasure and honor to welcome Don Johnson. It's first of all a personal pleasure because I was at the first discussions when you first thought of writing a book, which is a little while ago, when I was on sabbatical at the University of Georgia. And now I'm very happy that you are here to present the book. Don Johnson has a very rich experience in international trade, and he's today talking about the book The Wealth of a Nation, and we'll be discussing US trade history from both a longer view and a varied perspective. A long view by looking back into the future of the American trade policy, and looking at it from a varied range of perspectives. A personal one, his personal involvement, both most recently as an academic at the Rusk Center, reflecting on what was going on, but earlier also as an ambassador negotiating trade policy and as a state and US senator. So very different perspectives on trade policy, and I'm not surprised that there are quite a few people here today because it's also a moment when US trade policy is very much in the news. When I started studying international trade policy, nobody was interested unless they were in technical areas. But today it's in the news all the time because the new American president, I could describe him but I will refrain, has made it a very exciting topic, let's call it, by undermining both the international institutions and the expectations that we have from our allies. So, without further ado, I'm going to give the floor to Don Johnson. Thank you for coming, and he will speak for about 30 minutes. That is an agreement between the two of us because he told me that he always speaks longer. So I'm giving him 30 minutes so he can speak 45 minutes, and then the floor will be open to questions.
Well, thank you.
It's on, I think.
It's on? Okay. Well, thank you very much, Kim. I really appreciate you organizing this event. Kim travels so much it's hard to keep up with him. He's in Taiwan or Singapore or Vienna last week. I never know where he is or where this event was going to take place, and so luckily I got an email from him this morning saying that it was very close to the Schumann Plus, and so I was able to find it just in time to get it here. But anyway, I'm very grateful to Kim, my old friend, who has been a friend here in Brussels when I'm here, and also a friend in Georgia and elsewhere. We see him very often. But anyway, I really appreciate him organizing this, and I'm happy to see a lot of my old friends here who have been involved with me, both in Brussels and many other places. But my wife Suzanne is here with me as well, and we always enjoy spending time in Brussels, and this is no exception, of course. I wanted to begin the discussion. You'll notice the book sounds like the title of another book, and it really has nothing to do with Adam Smith. He used that title, and he didn't ask me if he could use the title, and so I didn't ask him if I could use it. So. But I did quote from him quite a lot in the book, and in fact the book begins with a quote from him that I think is very important to today's world. In fact, if you do research on the subject of international trade, you'll find that the arguments repeat themselves really throughout the last 250 years. Is basically what this book covers. He wrote in his book, titled The Wealth of Nations, to promote the little interest of one little order of men in one country, it hurts the interest of all other orders of men in that country, and of all men in all other countries. Now that's a very simple explanation of what the problems of international trade are, and you'll see that when President Trump today tries to protect steel and aluminum in the United States, it hurts the orders of other men and women in the United States, but also in many other parts of the world, including the EU. And So that gives you a good description of really what the problems are. And that's just one sector. We also see that from the beginning that when you try to protect the interest of the land barons in England in the 18th century, you hurt the working class. When you try to protect the monopolies of the East India Company, for example, you hurt the other businesses, the small businesses and others. And when you try to protect industry, whether they be infant industries or others, you hurt the other industries, industries who want to export. And we found that to be true throughout the last 250 years, throughout American history and also throughout European history and Chinese history, no matter where you are. So that's really what this book is all about. And I found that the political arguments run consistently from the beginning of this to the end. And one of the things that I found, and the reason I wanted to use Adam Smith's book as the foundation of my book, is that the founding fathers of America, Jefferson, Hamilton, Benjamin Franklin, all of those guys, you know, basically were very familiar with this book. In fact, Franklin read the manuscript in London of Adam Smith. He was a friend of Smith's when he was the agent for Pennsylvania in London. And they became friends, and he met with him in Edinburgh and Glasgow, and then also in London. But Jefferson loved this book, and he recommended it to a number of people. Hamilton also read it, but he got a different impression from it. He thought it was very naive to think that you could have free trade when you had countries like Britain and others, large European countries like France, that had much more powerful industries and much more capability when you had a small country that was just developing, like the United States, without protection. So he wrote a report to Congress called the Report on Manufactures that was the foundation of the protectionism of America. And he proposed things that are much like what we see in China today or in many other developing countries, where he proposed subsidies, he proposed higher tariffs, he proposed any number of things about new technology. In fact, he stole the technology of Britain on textiles, brought it over to the United States, created an industry in what is now Paterson, New Jersey. It didn't work out very well, but it's basically the same thing that we are criticizing other countries for doing today in America, all through the early parts of the growth of America. Jefferson, on the other hand, in a report to Congress, he was the first Secretary of State, as Hamilton was the first Treasury Secretary. He proposed in language very similar from that in the Wealth of Nations, sort of a free trade approach where you had agreements with countries like France. Now, he was very much a Francophile, and he didn't much like Great Britain, even though Hamilton also was in the Battle of Yorktown, and but he was more of an Anglophile, and in fact he said that he felt that Jefferson and Madison's favoring France over England was kind of a womanish thing. That and I never quite understood that sort of Freudian approach to international trade, but he said he thought that it was going to lead to a war pretty soon, and in fact it did with the War of 1812. But his views were protectionist, and Jefferson's views were much more toward free trade with reciprocity, and he thought that they could have a reciprocal trade agreement. In fact, they did have a reciprocal trade agreement with France early on, but France had some internal difficulties. That's the way he described it in his report to Congress. Of course, he was talking about the Reign of Terror, when a number of Jefferson's friends were being decapitated. He called those internal difficulties. But anyway, when Jefferson became president, he also became more protectionist and imposed an embargo on both Britain and France during the period of the Napoleonic Wars. So I'm going to skip forward. I can't get bogged down here with some of these details, but during the period, the early period of American history, we had a period of high protection, especially after the War of 1812, and Henry Clay started the American system, which was to have high tariffs and block all of the trade from Britain, who began dumping their goods into our country, and so he wanted to have just a system of trade within the United States. But they raised the tariffs so high that the southern states tried to block the higher tariffs, and in fact began to institute a period of nullification. And David Hull is back there, and he understands that in the South that meant war because it was an early possibility of a civil war. And when Andrew Jackson came into power, he almost led a charge into South Carolina, which happened to be his home state or his birth state, and his vice president was John C. Calhoun, and he was the one who was trying to do the nullification, and he wanted to hang his vice president, John C. Calhoun, and but finally they resolved it, and they reached a period of low tariffs leading all the way up to the Civil War. And so when President Trump puts a portrait of Andrew Jackson in the Oval Office, he kind of confuses things, because although Jackson was a populist, he was a low tariff and free trade populist, and he got all that mixed up. But he's not really one to try to stick with true history. He just gets his facts up, mixed up a little bit sometimes. And then he says, when somebody corrects him, he says, well, that's, what is it he says?
Sell them something good.
It's
fake news?
Fake news, that's the word. So that's fake history, that Jackson was a populist who favored protectionism. But during the Civil War, the need for additional revenue was such that they started raising tariffs again. As you may remember, of course my British friends here will remember that, that the Brits lowered tariffs and entered a period of free trade. At the same time, basically, that Jackson entered a period of free trade in America. But we began raising tariffs and had the highest period of protectionism all the way through the latter part of the 19th century after the Civil War. That was a period of the robber barons. And the robber barons came in, and whatever they asked for in terms of high tariffs, they got. And they all, held up Hamilton as being their, founding father and the god of protectionism, and they based all of their theory on that. But actually, they were taking the money that came from high tariffs and putting it in their pockets, whether it was steel or the industrialization of textiles and so forth. But they kept saying that they were doing it to help the working class. But the working class never got anything out of protection, and so that was the whole period of the robber baron era was in the the late 19th century, and I always like to point out that most people think of the robber barons as Andrew Carnegie and others who made millions of multimillionaires. And then, out of steel and so forth. But there was one guy named Joseph Wharton. Joseph Wharton, during the Civil War, was able to buy nickel mines. And he went to the Congress. There had been no tariffs on nickel before. and he asked for Congress to raise the tariff on nickel. And they said, well, why? There's not much import. So he said, well, I'd like for you to do it. And he did it. The Congress basically gave any tariff that anybody asked for, any robber baron who paid money. And the Senate at that time was elected by the state house, the state legislatures. They weren't elected by the people because the Congress, during the Constitutional Convention, they didn't trust the people. They wanted to have the Senate elected by state legislatures because they felt that the people were not qualified to make judgments on the Senate, so they wanted to have a backdrop protection against what the people might decide. And but what happened was that the monopolies like Standard Oil, John D. Rockefeller, and others were able to go in and buy senators, and so you had a senator not from Ohio but from Standard Oil, a senator from the Sugar Trust, senator from other monopolies, that just the things that that Adam Smith was trying to write against back in the 18th century during the industrialization of Britain. And but Joseph Wharton went in and asked for this tariff on nickel, and he was able to get it. He bought some more nickel mines, and then he comes into Congress and said, I would like Congress to create a new coin. And so Congress did. And what coin do you think that might have been? Well, there's a coin in the United States. Well, there's a dime, and there's a quarter, and there's also a penny. Well, this was a new coin, and it was a nickel. So they created a coin for Joseph Wharton called a nickel. So they produced the nickel, and then Joseph Wharton was able to deplete all of his nickel mine using this nickel. And so he became very wealthy, and he depleted his mines, but he then got into steel, created the Bethlehem Steel Company, another giant steel industry, and then he created the military-industrial complex. So he was very fortunate, but he was also very effective in lobbying. He ran the first really effective lobbying group was the Iron and Steel Institute, and he was in charge of that. So like many of the robber barons, he became a philanthropist. And one of the institutions that he created was the first business school in the world, the Wharton Business School in Pennsylvania. Now, I don't know how much news, I know you all keep up with our politics a lot better than we keep up with yours, but one of our famous politicians likes to talk about a school that he went to, and that is the Wharton Business School, and that is the current President of the United States. And in that school, Joseph Wharton insisted that the charter state that this business school would teach all sorts of business techniques, but it insisted that all the professors teach protectionism in the business school, and do so without apology. That's in the actual charter, that unapologetically teach protectionism. This is in the 1880s. But anyway, so I'm jumping forward now because I don't want to take up my entire 30 minutes talking about the robber barons. But in the early, there was much labor strife, and a lot of the progressives caught on to what was going on with the protectionism, and so there was a shift towards freer trade and tariff reform by the turn of the century, in the turn of the 20th century. And the investigative reporters started pushing for tariff reform. These are the people that Teddy Roosevelt called the muckrakers. And they started wearing that term as a badge of honor. They all promoted tariff reform. And even Teddy Roosevelt promoted it somewhat, but the Republicans were so invested in protectionism, they wouldn't let him do it when he became president, even though he promoted some things like trust busting and anti-monopolies and the Sherman Antitrust Act and that sort of thing. And also William Howard Taft also was, they had both been taught in the Ivy League schools that free trade was better than protectionism, and they understood that, but they couldn't get it done through the protectionist Republican Congress. So, you know, at that time, the Democrats were in favor of free trade, the Republicans were in favor of protectionism. Woodrow Wilson got elected in 1913, and he pushed through the first true tariff reform bill and a lot of progressive legislation during his time as president. And you all know about what he did in trying to promote the League of Nations and you know, in the post-World War I period, and also, you know, what he did all during that time period in terms of better labor promotion and created the Federal Reserve System, and he made a lot of progressive labor reforms and also financial reforms. But after World War I, we had a deep recession, and the Democrats lost. You had Harding, Coolidge, and Herbert Hoover came in, and they started reducing taxes again and raising tariffs. So that's what brought us to the highest tariff bill in history, or thereabouts. It came at a time when, I mean, you can argue whether it was the highest because of depending on other factors involved, but the Smoot-Hawley Tariff Bill of 1930 came at a time when the great stock strike. I'm having a senior moment here, but the Great Depression occurred after the stock crisis of 1929, and so you had the depression that came, and the tariff hike of 1930, the Smoot-Hawley bill, became a tremendous political detriment to the Republicans, and of course Franklin Roosevelt, and got elected in 1932 and began the New Deal efforts. And along with the New Deal came Cordell Hull's effort for tariff reform and the beginning of the creation of the international trading system. Now, it began very slowly because you know, you had the Great Depression to go through. Cordell Hull was a senator from Tennessee. He was very widely respected by the Southern senators, and he gave great help to Roosevelt, and therefore Roosevelt was very strongly behind his efforts. Cordell Hull had a lot of problems with not only the Republicans that were left in the Congress, but also with some of the New Deal people, because some of the New Deal people fought what he was trying to do because they felt that some of his efforts were slowing down their efforts to unemployment, some of their proposals for unemployment. They thought it might be a diversion. But he slowly created the multilateral, non-discriminatory trading system by doing it one by one with his Reciprocal Trade Agreement Act, starting with Brazil, and then one by one he went to Belgium. Had a major agreement here with Belgium on steel. It was criticized by some of the steel people in America because it created some benefits for you know, tariffs on steel coming into the United States. But he kept pushing for it, and then election by election, you know, it got a little tougher to do these deals. But by the time that the war started in 1939 here, and the effort to bring the United States into the war, the relationship between Churchill and the United States was beginning to develop. And in 1941, of course, Britain had already been in the war by that time for 2 years, and Churchill wanted Roosevelt to bring the United States into the war. They met in the Atlantic off Placentia Bay in Newfoundland in 2 battleships. And in a short meeting, they wrote and signed the Atlantic Charter. And of course, the United States was not even in the war at that time, but the United States under Roosevelt wanted to show Americans what this war was all about, because he was fighting the isolationists, and he wanted to help Britain, but he didn't know exactly how to do it while fighting the isolationists in the Congress. And so he wanted this Atlantic Charter to show what this war was about and how we could help with and bring about a positive end. So they wrote this charter that explained what the war was about and what it was going to be like after the war, even though we weren't in it. And so one of the principles in the charter was to have free trade and non-discriminatory trade after the war in a broad-based organization. Now, one of the things that was that I didn't mention earlier was Cordell Hull had always promoted an international trade organization. In 1916, during World War I, before we had entered the war, he gave a speech in the Congress promoting an international trade organization to solve disputes and urged the Wilson administration to adopt that. Now, Wilson, in his 14 points in the Paris Agreement, the treaty, that was one of his points, and Hull always claimed credit for that particular point. But so it had been in their book of proposals all along. But this was in the Atlantic Charter, so that's kind of the beginning of it. But Churchill and Roosevelt got in an argument about what this non-discriminatory trade meant. Did it mean to include the preferences of the imperial preferences? And Churchill said, we can't have that because that's, I have to keep my cabinet together, and we've got a lot of people who depend on those preferences. And you're not even in the war yet. We can't, get rid of that at this point. And so he put some language in the charter that Roosevelt agreed to. It says subject to current agreements, and that included the imperial preferences from the Ottawa Imperial Conference of 1930, which, by the way, was a reaction to a large degree, and some of you can question me if you disagree, but is in reaction to the Tariff Bill of 1930, the Smoot-Hawley Bill, because there was a lot of reaction that exacerbated the Depression. It didn't cause the Depression, but it exacerbated it by the reaction of all other countries at the time. And that's one of them, because the British, who had always been more free trade, by 1930, even Keynes was promoting raising tariffs, and he supported this imperial preference agreement that came out of Ottawa. And so that became a thorn in the side of all the negotiations from the time of 1941. And of course, in December of 1941, the United States came into the war after the Pearl Harbor attack. And then shortly after that, we started negotiating with the British all during the war, including the time of the Bretton Woods. But there was always, Bretton Woods covered currency exchange and some of the financial part of the trade. But the negotiations carried on primarily between the British and the Americans in the Anglo-American Agreement. And so it continued on all the way up, through the period when the Labor government took over after the Potsdam negotiations. I mean, the Potsdam discussions after the Germans surrendered. But one of the big problems, of course, was the Lend-Lease agreement ended after the Japanese surrendered, and that had been one of the strong parts of the Anglo-American alliance. And in that agreement was a provision about how the British and other allies were going to repay the Lend-Lease aid. One of those was that whatever the president agreed was going to be the consideration for this aid. They were not going to be paid back because they hadn't paid back all of the aid from World War I yet. And so we still had to be concerned about how that was going to be paid back. So the consideration in Cordell Hull's mind was that it was going to be an agreement where we'd have non-discriminatory trade. And so in Hull's mind, that was going to be ending the imperial preferences with non-discriminatory trade. And I hope this is not boring you, but I'm just trying to explain how we got to this point and how difficult it was, because at the end of the war, we finally reached an agreement. One of the things was when Churchill lost the election and the Labour government came in, we thought it might change because there might not be quite as much argument about those imperial preferences, because Labour had always been anti-imperialist up to that point, but things kind of changed at that point. Sir Stafford Cripps became the chief negotiator. He was the Chancellor of the Exchequer, and became head of the British negotiating team eventually. But he was a very difficult negotiator. I say difficult. He was a tough negotiator. And he was, had been a socialist, and he got kicked out of the Labour Party at one point in the early 40s. But he created a real problem with reaching agreement on the gap. But we finally did reach an agreement, and a lot of it had to do with whether or not the British were going to take advantage of the Marshall Plan. So there was a lot of that discussion, and all of it is right here in this book. I even got pictures of Stafford Cripps and the British team in here. But so anyway, I'm going to skip forward on that. But I say that because it's so important, the statesmanship involved in creating the gap and all of the give and take there in the creation of the European Union as well, because the American team pushed to bring the community together, and a lot of it has to do, of course, with the Cold War and the efforts of what Stalin was doing at that time, and how important that was. But it was also because of the destruction of the war, and how we wanted to, I said we, the United States wanted to supply aid to Europe, but also to do it in such a way that it would bring the country together, and so that was all the countries were just in devastating situation. I don't have to explain that to you, but it was very important to the establishment of this, not only ultimately to create the European community, but also to create the gap, and then move on to create what became, or what would have become, the International Trade Organization in Havana. So that was another thing that was very important, because in it we had provisions about full employment and also labor rights. Had we been able to conclude and approve and ratify the Havana Charter, I think we would have solved a lot of the issues that we have today, because we went to Havana and worked very hard in getting that signed and agreed to, and there were a lot of disputes there between the developing countries and the not only the developed countries, but between the developed countries. The United States and Britain, for example, who had worked so closely together, but at the end there were big disputes. And I'll mention just one, and that was on wool. We don't think very much about wool as being such a difficult, issue or such an important issue. But at the time, at the end of the war, or all during the war, wool was not such a big issue because we needed so much wool for uniforms all over the Allied nations, and including, of course, the American uniforms. But at the end of the war, when we weren't wearing uniforms, wool was a very important export for New Zealand and Australia and a number of the Commonwealth countries. And but in America, a lot of the agricultural states wanted to have higher tariffs on wool. So our negotiators would come to Geneva in the first stages of the GATT negotiations, and our negotiators wanted to be able to offer lower tariffs on wool, and all they were initially able to offer was just no increased tariffs on wool, and so when they got there, the New Zealanders and Australians said, "Look, you're not offering us anything," and our guys said, "Look, we're doing the best we can to come here and not have higher tariffs." Well, back home in Washington, Congress was raising the tariffs on wool. And so the lead negotiator flew back to Washington and said, "Look, you can't do this. You're destroying this possibility. We need this GATT agreement." And Truman didn't know what to do. He was in the middle of, the Republicans had just taken over Congress in 1946. This was 1947. Everybody thought he was going to lose in 1948. I mean, if you know anything about American history, in 1947, his polls were at 32%. It was the lowest poll rating of almost in history at that point. And the Republicans were offering Tom Dewey, then the governor of New York, and they were designing new draperies for the White House Oval Office. All the Republicans were, and they were deciding who they were going to appoint to the cabinet officers. I mean, they just knew they were going to win. And the Secretary of Agriculture comes into the office of Truman and argues that, "Look, you're going to lose 3 states out west if you veto this bill." And our negotiator from the State Department, the first Undersecretary of State for Finance, for Economics, he says, "You have got to veto this bill. If you veto this bill, if you don't veto this bill, the New Zealanders and the Australians and others, every other wool producer in the Commonwealth is leaving, and Britain is going with them. We lose all of these people, and no longer, we don't have a GATT anymore at all." And the British had already, told us that, and it was true. They were going because the British didn't like it anyway. They didn't like the imperial preference thing going away. And in fact, we didn't ever get that totally, but so Truman vetoes it. He took the risk, and so that's a very courageous stand. And you think it's just for wool, it didn't matter, but it was. He almost lost 3 states, and on election night, every paper in the country said he was going to lose. And in fact, there's a real famous picture you may have seen where he's holding up the Chicago Tribune, and it says, "Dewey wins. Dewey's the new president." And Truman's holding this paper up, and he won. By the next morning, he had actually won, but just barely. And so, that just shows how much courage he had to do what was right to keep this, this GATT going. And I just ask you, would Trump have been willing to risk that? I mean, it's just, so this whole thing of the creation of the GATT, and eventually we lost the Havana Charter. They signed off on it, but by the time it got to Congress, the Korean War had started, and they had had one hearing on this in the Congress, and some of you know who F.A. Hayek is. You know, he went to the school I went to. I mean, he taught at the school, and then he went to the University of Chicago. But he wrote this book in 1945, and it became very popular on both sides of the Atlantic, called The Road to Serfdom. And of course, at this time, Stalin was occupying, you know, a good portion of behind the Iron Curtain, and everybody thought that we were going to socialism. There had the McCarthy period in the United States where they were everybody had to defend themselves from not being a communist. And he, this book, Reader's Digest is a little publication in the United States that was very popular, especially back then. And they summarized books. They summarized this book into 20 pages, and it was widely read. And then Look magazine, which was a popular magazine at the time, created a cartoon version, a comic book version of The Road to Serfdom, printed 20 million copies of it, or printed a ton of copies of it. And then General Motors makes Chevrolet cars. They printed 20 million copies of it and put it out all over the country. So it became a very popular book, and it affected this Havana Charter, mainly because of the provisions about labor rights and full employment in that Havana Charter. And so when the business, which was turning toward free trade at that point, when they testified on this charter, they said, look, labor rights should have nothing to do with trade. So we're opposed to this. We want you to be opposed to it. So they didn't ever even vote on the Havana Charter. And that would have created the International Trade Organization with provisions about labor rights. They weren't very strong provisions, but they just gave a basis for it that could have been built upon. After that, Eisenhower was elected Republican president, and he ran for president. Nobody thought he was going to run until the last minute, and they didn't know whether he was going to run as a Republican or a Democrat. But he decided to run against Robert Taft, who was an isolationist, and he felt that he didn't want to have a Republican elected as an isolationist. And he was the son of William Howard Taft, who had been president in the teens and Supreme Court justice. But Eisenhower was the first Republican president who supported trade, and he supported the gap, and so we were lucky about that. And then, of course, Kennedy supported trade. Every president after that supported trade. So the one we have now is the first one not to support trade in a way that we think is helpful. We've had the biggest problem we've had since that time has been with labor rights and the environment, and a lot of us have worked on that. I worked on it with Cambodia, and we've tried to work on it in other ways too, but it's still a problem. But even in the NAFTA or the TPP agreement, and it's not a big problem, of course, with TTIP. When we had the TTIP agreement, we were working on with the EU because the EU has strong labor, rights, and we do. So, but it was a problem with Asia and with Latin America, and it's been improved with TPIP when Mexico was part of that. So we. That was kind of worked out there. It's improved a little bit, I think, also in this new NAFTA that Trump's renamed. So I'm sorry I wasn't holding this up. All right, but I'll stop there. I've talked way too long. I probably went over 40 minutes. Okay. So I'll be happy to answer any questions you have.
So the floor is open to questions. Anybody who has a question, this is the moment to come forward. And there we have that.
I just wanted to ask you, how will you project the developments in the future, and especially in terms of multilateralism, which is right now suffering enormously. Do you anticipate any kind of changes in the approach of the United States, especially to the World Trade Organization, and how do you see development with a horizon of, let's say, 10 years' time? More modest.
A very easy question to start with.
Well, I think multilateralism is threatened seriously by our current administration. So that's where you have to start. I've written about this myself some time ago. In fact, I wrote about it in the book, and then I wrote about it in a law review article as well. Because from day one, in his executive order where he withdrew from TPP, he said he had directed the USTR to begin negotiations or withdraw from all multilateral negotiations like TPP. He mentioned that in the order, and that was drafted by Bannon. Steve Bannon, I haven't seen your moment again, but anyway, he drafted that. That's a very nationalistic approach. And obviously the reason for that is he wants to use all of the leverage that he has as a president of the United States, the strongest, largest economy in the world, and that he thinks he can gain more leverage in negotiating on a bilateral basis. That takes us back to the mercantilist period. And really that's a very unsophisticated approach that is, it may be sophisticated in terms of doing real estate deals and building apartment houses, and and I don't want to belittle that approach based on his business experience, but that's clearly where it comes from. Now he has some really sophisticated people in his trade organization, mainly Bob Lighthizer. And I think that Dennis Shea is also, who is the U.S. ambassador. I just met him for the first time last week. But I have a strong impression that he's also very sophisticated too. But they have a different approach. You can read a lot of things into what Lighthizer has done in the past. He's had great experience as chief counsel to the Senate Finance Committee under Bob Dole, who you may remember was the ran for president against Clinton in 1996, and was a senior leader in the Senate for a long time. At a young age, Bob Lighthizer had that job, and then he went to be deputy USTR in the Reagan administration, and was pretty effective in an approach of managing trade with Japan, and got Japan to enter into voluntary trade limitations. And that's not what we normally think of as good pro-trade agreements. It's not. It's sort of, generally speaking, not WTO consistent. But it's more WTO consistent than involuntary trade. What am I trying to think of? Not export. What?
Voluntary export restraints.
Yeah. Voluntary export restraints are not as bad as import restraints. Quotas is what I'm trying to think of. Yeah. But that's his approach. And then after he left there, he went to be a principal lobbyist for steel. Steel and textiles are the two most protected industries in America. I guess maybe around the world. But so that's his history. And if you read his testimony, which I've got a lot of in the book, just to kind of get an appearance of, or get an idea about what his approach is. He is very nationalistic, but it's much more sophisticated than Trump's is. So that's the fear, is that, and I think he's behind stopping or blocking these new appellate judges. And so I think as long as they are in power, we're going to have difficulty on multilateralism. And so I'd be greatly concerned. I don't know, that doesn't go out 10 years because they hopefully can't stay that long. And so I hope, it won't last that long. But I think we may have a follow-up question on that point, but I think the approach should be just to dodge it for a while. But, it's not good tidings for the future, short-term future at least. Yes.
Yeah, it seems as if a lot of U.S. policy is aimed against China. Mm-hmm. So is there some other approach to U.S. policy that can be employed other than tariffs to address issues such as dumping of Chinese products?
Policy by whom? Or
by the U.S.
By the U.S.
Other than tariffs.
Oh, okay. Well, there should be. That seems to be the approach that they're taking. I think that they're taking two main actions, or Section 301 against China, and I think that they're in uncharted waters there regarding the use of tariffs under 301 for something that's not really tariff related, because what they're doing is on the forced technology transfers. I think it's arguable whether you can use 301 for that. Now, in both of these things, it's kind of uncharted water. The other one is 232 under the 1962 Act, and that's on national security. They're using that for steel and aluminum. They're also in uncharted waters there because that's never been used before either for that purpose. And it's hard to say that that's a valid use of that. I think many trade lawyers have said it's not a valid use of it because, first of all, steel is used for national security, but Secretary James Mattis has said that we would only use like 1 or 2% of our steel manufacturing for national security purposes. And if you're using that for against our allies, including the EU, Canada, Mexico, how can you say that's for national security? But the problem is that under the WTO Article 21, you've never questioned. It's supposed to be discretionary, I guess, and that's what the United States is arguing, is that you can't question what we're using it. The basis for that. If we say it's for our national security, nobody can question that. And if that's the case, then you could argue that anything is on a national security basis. It's just the king can be cannot be wrong, and I think that's incorrect. There's got to be some basis for it. So I think most people say that's incorrect use of it. Now, is there some other alternative besides tariffs to do those same things? I don't know. I don't know that there would be. They obviously don't think there's anything effective that is doing it, and I'm not sure that's effective, because what they've argued is that they're doing it to reduce the trade deficit. Well, that's obviously not going to reduce the trade deficit in either case. So you got to look at what their purpose is, and if that's their purpose, they should choose some other alternative that would not be tariffs, and that it would be reducing the government spending. Would be, but it doesn't involve other countries. So I don't know the answer to that question if it's an action against another country, because that's not going to produce the effect that they want to anyway. Yes.
What would you consider to be the goal behind the blocking of the WTO appellate judges? Is it really an honest cry for reform of the organization, or are they really wanting to blow up the organization? And if it is a demand for reform, which kind of reforms do you think that would address the problems the U.S. has with the organization?
I think it's hard to say, really, because their explanations to date have not been very I don't think they've been very explanatory. They've not explained it very well. So if they're not willing to explain it, then it's hard for me to explain it. But I can only give a guess, and it seems to be that they are trying to change the system in a way that the thing about zeroing and some of the results that they have gotten that Lighthizer doesn't like. It seems to me that's where they're going with it. They don't like some of the results that the appellate body has given, and they say that the appellate body has gone beyond its authority, gone beyond what they've been given authority under the agreement. They've been authorized to do. That seems to me the basis for it. I mean, these other things like going beyond the 90 days to make the decision, and going beyond the time when the appellate body member time has expired, it just doesn't seem to be that big of a deal. And there's a basis for withholding the next nominee. That would be easy to correct, it seems like. But it seems, what I've seen Lighthizer complain about in the past is more of these other rationale. They didn't like the results in some cases.
Yes, I'm a law student of the VUB, and I had two questions. Thank you. So my first question is, how do you think that the trade war between China and the US will end? Because now they're taking economical sanctions, but do you think that a military action will be the next step? And my second question is a bit more specific. It's on the China and Pakistan economic corridor, the CPEC agreement. Would you agree with the fact that China is colonizing Pakistan with the CPEC agreement?
Well, let me just say on the, I certainly hope that the trade war doesn't end in a shooting war, and I don't think it will. And I don't see an indication of that. But, and I don't know enough about the colonization, or as you call it, between China and Pakistan to comment on that, frankly. So
when you look in your book at the politics of US trade over such a long period of time, And then you look specifically at the period of the WTO since 1995, so almost 25 years. And you're looking at the behavior of actors in American politics. Do you see a qualitative difference with respect to the period of time for which the WTO has been there with binding dispute settlement? Or is it just more of the same, and it just so happens that during this period it has been convenient for US political actors to play along with the WTO game? In other words, did the WTO constrain US domestic politics when it comes to international trade? Or is it that the US political system will never be fit and able to be bound into a multilateral system because it's always going to go its own way for domestic reasons?
Well, I think if you compare it to the EU, for example, I think you'll see some similarities. And I think it has tried to conform. Just to some extent, China has tried to conform, in the early days at least. I haven't followed it that closely since the early days. But in the early days, I think China tried to conform. It certainly made a lot of reforms, bringing its system into the, into the requirements of the system. But back to just the United States. When we passed the implementation of the WTO reforms, there was strong support for it. I think really on a bipartisan basis. That year, and I don't remember the actual vote count, but that year we didn't pass the NAFTA agreement with much Democratic support. I voted for it, but it was about a third of the Democrats that voted for it. And of course President Clinton was the primary supporter of it, and but you had the majority leader working against it. The Democratic majority leader was working against it, and then it passed with strong support from the Republicans minority. And so we were able to pass it, but it was a bipartisan support with a minority of Democrats that voted for it. And then on the WTO, I think it was, as I recall, it was much stronger bipartisan support. And but in that implementing legislation, you're allowed to vote. A member can ask for a vote to pull out every 5 years, and it's not automatic, but if a member introduces a resolution to pull out of the WTO, then you have a vote automatically on it. And I remember the first vote on that was, I think Bernie Sanders and I forget who the other person was that joined in that, introducing the resolution. But it didn't pass, but it got about 25% of the vote in the House. So it didn't have enough to pass and then go to the Senate. The Senate didn't raise it at all, and so it's very low support to pull out after 5 years. And then 5 years later, you had the same thing with Bernie Sanders again introducing a resolution to pull out. And again, there's a very low, support for it. And then after 15 years, nobody introduced it, and it never had a vote in the Senate at all. So I just say that to point out that there was very strong support for the WTO during the entire first 15 years, and then it never had a vote on it again. So there's still very strong support for it. And then when Trump started making so much noise about the WTO this year and last year, there was very strong bipartisan support, for the WTO in antagonism to his, his statements against it. So I feel like there's very strong support for the WTO, in the Congress. And that's really all I can go on. Now, if you take polling on it, I see polling that is very strong for trade generally. And that kind of surprised me because I said very strong, there's a plurality for it. and sometimes a majority, like 51% or something like that, you know. And so, you know, with all the negative political rhetoric about trade, to still have a majority and at least a plurality for trade is, you know, it's kind of surprising. And especially with Trump going around, you know, making all these crazy statements like it's the worst agreement in the history of the universe. And then he comes in and does a new trade agreement on NAFTA, which only just slightly modifies NAFTA. But he's changed the name of it, and it sounds like he's, you know, created a new apple out of a slightly different apple. You know, it's a different world that we live in. So I think that there's really strong support. I don't think it would pass if he tried to pull out of the WTO, but he can wreck it, you know, with what he does, just like he could have wrecked NAFTA. And the business community would go wild about it.
So can I ask a follow-up then? So if
Sure.
the objective is to constrain China,
Yeah.
why do the objective is to constrain China? Why doesn't the United States use the WTO system to constrain China instead of wrecking the WTO system? That seems to be a mismatch between the stated objective or rooted objective
Yeah.
and the obvious means of contributing towards achieving that objective.
Well, first of all, they are using it to some extent. I think they've got cases against China at the WTO, and I was just, as I said, I was just in Geneva this past week, and I heard a lot of talk about the debate between China and the WTO. I mean, China and the U.S. At the WTO in the General Council meetings and elsewhere. So there apparently is still a lot of that going on. And if you ask Ambassador Dennis Shea that question, he will say that, look, we just had a big debate at the WTO between China and the U.S., and you read about it too. They still are doing a lot of that. But I think what Trump and Lighthizer are doing with these giant tariff increases are just making noise. And it's, I mean, it's not to say they're not trying to, you know, make a difference in some way, but they to increase the tariffs on $200 billion worth of goods makes a lot more noise than going to the WTO and having a conversation that nobody hears. It's like a tree falling in the woods, and you know it didn't happen. You know, you don't know it happens. And so you got to take a look at what the way Trump operates. You know, he likes to threaten to pull out of NAFTA, and you know, threaten this and threaten that, and it depends on what Bob Mueller's doing here, you know, and who's being indicted there, and you know, it's just what's the new distraction that he needs. I don't know. I'm sorry to put it that way, but that's the way I see it. It's but also I think he is legitimately trying to create a big stink, and it's sort of like the thing with Obama's birth certificate. Everybody knows that he was born in Hawaii, you know, but how much noise can you make with continuing to say he was born in Kenya? And I've got the proof of it, and I can. All my investigators are there in Hawaii, proving it right now. And so, you know, I mean, that's what we're dealing with. It's and like how many people were at my inauguration? Yeah, I can show you thousands, a lot more than there were at Obama's. You know, and I can prove it by just and when at the 9/11. You know, when 9/11 happened, you know, all of these people were jumping up and down, cheering. No proof of that, but if you say it, you know, he gets attention, and especially from his supporters.
Just like I never agreed to stop zero.
Maybe one final question?
Thank you for being here, Mr. Johnson. given current tensions with Saudi Arabia, what do you foresee between diplomatic and trade relations with Saudi Arabia and the United States?
Well, there should be some serious breakage there, I would say, because Jared's friend is should be in big trouble, but you know, I think there should be some serious I'm not sure how to say this exactly, but I mean that's a serious crime that was committed in Istanbul, and I'm not sure if Mr. Erdogan is going to get to the bottom of it, but maybe I should wait until we find out whether he does get to the bottom of it. But it's awfully incriminating. The Crown Prince, I would say.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. When you were just saying, that's the way I see it, that reminded me of another book of the Rusk Center, the book by Dean Rusk.
That's right.
As I saw it.
Yeah.
So it's nice to have a view in the way that you see it, and based on your experiences and your insights. Thank you very much for coming, and maybe a small round of applause for our speaker today. There are, of course, more sandwiches and drinks, and I'm sure we can ask some more questions with a glass of water or something else down there.
Okay, terrific. Thank you.